everyone, and welcome to this edition of FTT Chats. I'm Lisa Moyle, Director of Strategy at VC Innovations, and today we're delighted to be joined by Megan Gordon. Megan is a partner with Clifford Chance. Hello, Megan.
Hello, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Megan, I thought we could start with you telling us a little bit about you and your role at Clifford Chance, your area of focus.
I am a partner in our Washington, D.C. office of Clifford Chance, and I'm also one of the leaders of our U.S. technology practice. And my practice really focuses on both data privacy and security, as well as financial crimes compliance. So it's an exciting time for us and for our practice.
Yeah, well, that's a great introduction and segue into our next question, which is looking at the financial services sector. Clearly, technology has introduced a tremendous amount of change across the sector. Can you maybe highlight some of the challenges that presents?
Absolutely. I think we're really at a very interesting time in financial services. And the first thing I want to mention are the new entrants into the market. So traditionally, when we look back, let's say 20 years ago, you pretty much just had the bricks and mortar financial services companies. You went to the bank, you went to your branch, maybe you went and did a money transfer somewhere. But what we've seen is a real proliferation of financial services, and that's through money services businesses, through financial transfer companies. And what that's done is it's really created the ability for more people, not just in the United States, but globally, to have access to financial services, which is really fantastic because we've seen people who previously didn't have access now have access, be able to transfer money very quickly. And it's also allowed them to be able to build wealth in that way. So I think it's been a great thing in that way. The second is, of course, the rise of digital currency. So we now have Bitcoin, Ethereum, loads of others, where we're moving away from traditional currency. And I think the full potential of that is going to be seen in the next 5 to 10 years, but it's just at its infancy right now. The third is the rise of tokenization when it comes to securities, and how tokens are really taking the place of some of the securities and also proliferating around the world. And of course, I'd be remiss without mentioning data. Financial services is very tied to data, the amount of information that's collected about each of us, our spending trends, where we're spending money. It's all really come to the forefront, and it's a huge change in terms of financial services when you look back over the last 10, 20 years.
Great. That was a fantastic outline. Thank you, Megan. And thinking about some of the issues you flagged there and, casting an eye over some, what we see in the news all the time, data breaches, misuse of data, perhaps even consumers not understanding how their data is used. How do you think that can best be addressed? And in terms of the kind of ethical considerations, can that be designed into the technology from the start?
Absolutely. I think it's really important for ethics to be thought about when you're designing technology. The greatest example I always talk about is the fact that when Facebook was launched, it never would have thought that decades later it would be used by a foreign government to influence a US election. It just wasn't something that they would have thought of at the time, and who could have? But when technology reaches its full potential, sometimes it does have adverse consequences that should be thought about. So when you think about designing technology, the first and foremost, as you mentioned, definitely privacy. Everybody has to think about how this is going to impact privacy and individuals. The second is discrimination, because we see a lot with the advent of technology, and especially financial services technology, that you want it to be widely accessible and not to benefit certain groups or disadvantage others. And the third is on a financial crimes basis, how can this be used by criminals? One of the things that we see in the traditional banking sector is that they've spent decades trying to ensure that their institutions aren't used for money laundering, millions of dollars, huge programs. But as new technology comes into play, how are they also going to meet those standards to make sure that they're not misused? And the fourth is consumer protection. And this goes along with financial crimes, which is, of course, none of us want to be the victims of fraud. And as we have proliferation of different technologies, you now have new platforms that criminals can use to try to commit fraud, try to gain access to consumers. And because of that, all of these things should be thought of, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the best thing to do in terms of the future of the technology and making sure that it's marketable on a long-term basis.
You've brought up so many interesting points there, which are worthy of fuller discussions in and of themselves. And, you know, tying together all the kind of threads there that you laid out, do you think, kind of given all that change, the ethical concerns and considerations, the new technologies being leveraged, do you think that the current regulatory frameworks that are in place are sufficient? And do you think it's a case of updating regulation or expecting the industry to self-regulate? What are some of the ways to address some of the challenges that you outlined?
So I think that the current regulations on the books are really trying to put an old framework onto a new set of technologies. And sometimes it works, but in other ways it's really insufficient. I think as time goes forward, they're certainly trying to become more savvy on this, and they're going to create better regulatory environments for new technology. I think that industry also, it's difficult to get a full industry understanding of what needs to happen and to set those industry standards. I think it's important for there to be regulation in this environment. And I say that because you don't want to race to the bottom in terms of who can have less compliance and thus potentially more short-term profits versus those that are trying to do the right thing and thus at a higher cost basis. You really want at least a minimum set of regulations that tells everybody what the rules of the road are for different types of technology, in particular financial services. What we've seen is that the highly regulated industries such as banks are going to have a much higher cost basis than some of these lower regulated industries and new technology, which is good for the new technology. It allows it to develop. But of course, it also creates some of the problems that we spoke about earlier, which is why I think when it comes to financial services, it's important to have at least that baseline recognition of what the regulations are that have been developed and how it applies to the new technology.
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like in addition to those startups maturing, that the regulatory frameworks need to mature alongside them.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I know that you'll be joining us on the 9th of September for a more in-depth discussion around technology and ethics. And I think it's such a fascinating area. So I really look forward to hearing more from you on that subject on the 9th of September. And I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks.